will be this week.
You'll be sweating over there, dropless.
It's okay. I'll be sweaty and stinky and that'll be fine. No, no, Roy, what?
Maybe he's running late.
Maybe so. It's been a morning already. I walked out the door without my computer. I called my wife from the car. She could not get that computer to take my password to save her life.
Oh,
I thought, well, maybe it's on the SharePoint, maybe it's on our cloud server, and I'll have Carolyn print it when I get here. It wasn't on the cloud server. So I got in my car and I went back home and I got my computer, and Essie pretty much held down the fort in worship until I got back, came upstairs, plugged my computer in because it's so old that the battery from my wife unplugging it at home to driving here, maybe 15 minutes.
yeah.
Dead.
Gosh.
So I plugged it in, restarted it, and it's, the hamster is on life support that runs that.
Time for-
Yeah, I've been begging Carolyn and she's got a plan, but. And if y'all wanna see, you can probably walk in this upper transept, I think it's unlocked. Demolition is complete. In the sanctuary,
Is that
Framing.
already in the work one?
yes. Yes, that's the time. Yeah, the framing of the new chancel steps has begun.
Wow.
And leveling of the floor will be done in the first part of this week. And they expect to have all the tile here to begin tiling Thursday. So, yeah, it's moving right along. In fact, my guess is everything's gonna be done by July. And we're just gonna be waiting for the lift. Because the lift isn't supposed to arrive until July. So. We'll see. We'll see, but, and we discovered that the top of the chancel. Beautiful oak wood flooring.
Oh, wow.
We are not recarpeting that. We can carpet the stairs, the chancel stairs and the the build out of the chancel, but that original strip of chancel will just be refinished and stained to match the existing wood. Because it just kills me that people did, and I know like that wood flooring was just what everybody had, but then you take it up and you're like, do you know how much this costs now? All right, well, I don't see Roy. If he does, we'll pause and I will share the video. But I'll get us started. I need to step out while this is playing because somebody wants prayer downstairs. And I'll be back probably shortly.
As grand vizier, says the Bible, Joseph was installed in the city of On, later known as Heliopolis. It lies just 5 miles north of Cairo, near the city of Matariya. As a major city during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, On was chiefly known as a center for the worship of the sun god Atum. Since it was located at the apex of the Nile Delta, On was the obvious place to create a central depository of grain. Indeed, in the Book of the Dead, On, or Anu, is described as the place of multiplying bread, based on an ancient myth by which the god Horus fed the multitudes with only 7 loaves of bread, which is symbolic for the 7 souls of the god Ra.
As such, On was the perfect place to organize Egypt's newly nationalized agriculture. From here, Joseph could travel north to oversee the harvesting of the grain, or west across the Nile to supervise the gathering of dates, figs, and other fruits from the nearby fields of Fayum. Today, the fields of Fayum are as green and fertile as they were then. Driving along one of the many waterways in this region, we even stumbled upon a canal that is called Bara Yusuf, the Joseph Canal, to this day.
Here then, Joseph and his family lived for many years until one day Jacob passed away. His last wish was to be buried with his ancestors in the cave in the field of Machpelah, which today is located in the city of Hebron. This would naturally involve a long journey, so Joseph ordered that his father be embalmed according to Egyptian customs. Embalming was standard procedure for affluent Egyptians, as it was thought to preserve the integrity of a person's soul and body, his ka and ba. By keeping the exterior appearance of the body physically intact, the soul would recognize the body and return to it time and again. The secret of the embalming procedure was to remove all moisture from the body, thus eliminating the principal source of decay. To do so, Egyptian embalmers used various salt compounds, which were all harvested from the Nile. Internal organs prone to rapid decay were removed and stored in so-called canopic jars, the lids of which were shaped in the forms of the divinity to whom protection of the organs was consigned. It is believed that the embalming cult may have originated with the natural desiccation of corpses interred in Egypt's dry desert sands. Jacob and Joseph are the only biblical figures whose bodies undergo the procedure. Usually, Egyptian embalmers required 70 days, but Genesis tells us that it only took 40 days to prepare the body of Jacob, possibly because the primary purpose of the mummification was to preserve the body during the long journey to the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. With Jacob's death, the book of Genesis comes to an end, and the book of Exodus takes over the story. Both books have a different focus. The purpose of Genesis is to affirm God's covenant through the generations of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The aim of Exodus is to make this a tangible reality by virtue of the dramatic escape from Egypt. And indeed, when the story of Exodus opens, things soon begin to change dramatically. At first, all is well. Jacob's children marry and are fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong. Their herds grew as well, and eventually they may have tried their hand at cultivation. If so, they learned to till the land in the Egyptian fashion, planting crops after the floods of the Nile had receded and the soil was flush with fertile nitrates. The two principal crops grown in the Nile Delta were emmer wheat and barley, used to make bread and to brew beer, both staples of the average Egyptian's diet. This was complemented with lentils, beans, cabbage, dates, and occasionally fish. Only wealthy families were able to eat meat on a regular basis, principally chicken and beef. Like their Egyptian neighbors, the sons of Joseph may have gone fishing in the nearby lakes or hunted for duck in the marshes. They assimilated to Egyptian ways because, as Joseph once said, all shepherds are abhorrent to the Egyptians. There is no question that Goshen was a wonderful land, a paradise on earth. A papyrus document from the 19th dynasty, written around 1290 BC, says Goshen offered a wealth of good things.
The pools are filled with fish, the lagoons are thick with birds, the meadows are covered with succulent grass, the fruits from the cultivated fields all taste like honey. People are glad to be living here.
A fresco from the tomb of Nebamun, dated around 1356 BC, shows one nobleman during the hunt in the marshes, surrounded by the rich fowl of the region. Politically, however, all was not well. The old Egyptian dynasty that was evicted by the Hyksos did not go away. Instead, they moved down south to Thebes, where in the centuries to come, they would build the magnificent temples of Luxor. Here lived the kings of the 17th dynasty, and they had never given up hope that one day they would have sufficient armies to oust the Hyksos and reunify the land once more. The problem was that these kings also had to contend with foreign invaders from the kingdom of Kush, who saw that the power of Egypt was now much diminished, and they didn't hesitate to exploit the situation. The Kush invaders conquered many of Egypt's colonial possessions in Nubia, today's Sudan, thus robbing Thebes of a primary source of income as well as slaves. And then, to make matters worse, control of Upper Egypt was contested by a group of breakaway noblemen who ruled part of the region as the short-lived Abydos dynasty. But around 1570 BC, the 17th dynasty finally gathered up sufficient forces to launch its invasion of the north. A great battle fleet led by Pharaoh Sekenenre floated down the Nile. The pharaoh himself was killed in battle, but his army steadily ground its way northwards. Eventually, the Hyksos forces started to give way. After a clash of arms that left thousands dead or dying in the hot sand, a new dynasty, the 18th dynasty, led by King Ahmose I, emerged victorious. The war was won. Old Egypt had triumphed. Ahmose's successors continued the war of conquest straight into Canaan, vowing never again to suffer the humiliation of foreign control of their territory. They became warrior kings who wanted to create extensive buffer zones around the Egyptian homeland. A major battle was fought in the old Canaanite fortress of Megiddo, and much of Canaan was occupied by Egyptian forces. For the next 300 years, Megiddo became the main Egyptian administrative center in the region, with an Egyptian governor ruling over the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A new era, then of the new kingdom, had begun. How did the conquest by the Ancien Régime, the kings of Thebes, affect the Hebrews living in Goshen? For centuries now, they had been assimilated to Egyptian culture, harvesting their land. They were no longer the nomads from the days of Jacob. They were settlers who built their lives around the mud brick homes that sheltered their families. Perhaps they were left in peace to till their land, at least initially, until the warrior kings of the 18th dynasty, such as Thutmose III, pursued their dream of a vast Egyptian empire across much of the Near East. Their prejudice against the Habiru, the sand dwellers so despised by Egyptians, is proclaimed by Thutmose's reliefs in Karnak.
Thou hast smitten the sand dwellers as living captives. Thou hast made captive the heads of the Asiatics of Canaan.
This would suggest that the sand dwellers still living in Goshen would have been viewed with suspicion as well. And eventually, this suspicion would turn into outright hatred. This is the time frame of the most famous Egyptian pharaoh today, the boy king Tutankhamun. The young man rose to the throne shortly after the disastrous rule of King Akhenaten, who sought to do away with Egypt's pantheon of gods and instead enforced the rule of a single god, Egypt's ancient deity, the sun god Aten. He also moved his court from Thebes to a city in central Egypt, now identified with El Amarna. The king's total commitment to religious affairs led to his neglect of Egypt's vassal states in the east. But in 1336 BC, Egypt's experiment with monotheism came to an end. After Akhenaten died, Tutankhamun moved the court back to Thebes and restored the worship of the gods. The net result was that Egypt's grip on its eastern territories had begun to crumble under the relentless pressure of foreign invaders and local warlords. The Egyptian economy had suffered as well. This would probably have led to another intermediate period of political turmoil, were it not for the arrival of a new and even more warrior-like group of kings, the 19th dynasty. For example, King Seti I readily saw that Egypt needed a new military effort to secure its empire. He had seen that many garrisons were poorly staffed or abandoned. What was needed then was a string of new fortified garrisons in the north to deter any possible invaders. The ideal place, as the Hyksos kings had also found, was the eastern Nile Delta. This is where Seti I built one of the first garrison cities, later expanded by Ramses II. It was called Pi-Ramesses, or the house of Ramses I, Seti's father. It is located near the village of Qantir, some 70 miles north of Cairo. Archaeological excavations have shown that it was one of the largest cities in Lower Egypt, with a population of more than 300,000. And here, on this ground, the history of Egypt and the stories of the Bible come together, because the book of Exodus calls this the supply city of Ramesses. There was only one problem: who was going to build all these wonderful works? With so many young Egyptians serving Seti's armed forces, where was the king going to find the labor to realize this and other construction projects? The book of Exodus has the answer. According to the Bible, the king had turned his attention to the Israelite tribes herding their sheep and cultivating their land in the Nile Delta, and he marveled at their sheer numbers. Exodus suggests that even after some 400 years of settlement in Goshen, the Israelites were still considered a separate community with distinct Asiatic roots.
Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase and, in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they sent taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh.
Now that we know Egypt's history during this period, the animosity toward the Hebrews during the 19th dynasty begins to seem plausible. Almost every pharaoh since Ahmose I had found himself fighting one invasion from the east after another. And given the labor shortages of Seti's reign, the decision to turn the Israelites into forced labor would be a logical next step. Earlier, the book of Exodus says, "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." What that means is that the kings of the new kingdom no longer recognized this special license by which Joseph and his family had gained permanent resident status in the Nile Delta. They were foreigners, pure and simple, and should be exploited as such. And now there follows a twist which is sometimes difficult to understand. Exodus says that the Egyptians began to fear the Israelites so much that they ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill all the male babies born in their community. That doesn't seem to make much sense. If Pharaoh needed so many workers, why would he be concerned about the rapid growth of his labor pool? Perhaps the answer is that, as Pharaoh himself said, they could join Egypt's enemies and instigate another Hyksos-type revolt. The murder of the Hebrew infants will, in a later chapter, justify the terrible retribution of the 10th plague, when all the Egyptian firstborn sons are slain. Whatever the case may be, the massacre sets the stage for the story of a Hebrew couple from the tribe of Levi, who tried to save their newborn son by setting him adrift on the river in a basket made of papyrus and plastered with bitumen and pitch. As we saw before, the Bible doesn't hesitate to borrow motifs from Mesopotamian or Egyptian literature to amplify its meaning. In this case, the story has a close parallel with the story of King Sargon I, founder of the Akkadian Empire. When he was born, his mother, a foreign princess, feared for his life. Therefore, as Sargon told his story, she put me in a box made of reeds and plastered with bitumen. She cast me in the river, which carried me along and brought me to Aki, the water pool. Aki took me up and raised me as his son. The same thing happened to young Moses. The basket carried him down the river, watched over by his older sister Miriam, until it was spotted by the daughter of Pharaoh. She ordered one of her servants to retrieve it. When she saw the crying babe, she took pity on it. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Miriam rushed to the scene and said, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and so little Moses and his mother were reunited until such time that Pharaoh's daughter took him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, it's true that the Hebrew verb moshe means to draw out, but Moshe or Moses was also a very common patronymic in Egypt, as in Tutmose, meaning son of Tut, meant to invoke the blessings of the deity. But who was Moses really? Even though he is a cardinal figure in the Jewish faith, the lawgiver of the Jewish nation, the book of Exodus depicts him as a somewhat mysterious character. Although we know much about the history of Egypt, the period in which the story of Moses is set, Moses himself does not appear in any Egyptian records, and the information in Exodus is sometimes contradictory. For example, Moses is a Hebrew, but he is raised at the court of Pharaoh as an Egyptian prince. And yet he is somehow able to make his way across the Sinai desert and survive. He feels a kinship with the Israelites of Goshen, but they consider him an outsider. During the Exodus itself, the Hebrews will constantly conspire against him. And even though he is raised in luxury, Moses only finds true happiness while living as a shepherd in the Midian desert with his Canaanite wife, Zipporah.
I think the book of Exodus actually presents him to us as an ambiguous character with an ambiguous identity. And for the first few chapters of the book, he's trying to figure out who he is. And it's so interesting to see how his self-perception develops and then how other people's perception of him is expressed.
One day, when Moses is a grown man, he visits the construction pits to watch the Hebrews toiling away. It so happens that one of the supervisors is beating a slave, one of his kinfolk. Incensed, Moses looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. But eventually, Pharaoh hears of it and seeks to punish Moses by killing him. Moses has no choice but to flee in the wilderness of Sinai.
When Moses killed the overseer, I think that it signaled that his allegiance was no longer with the Egyptian powers that be, but that he was switching allegiances, that he had this impulse to side with the oppressed. And it now becomes dangerous for him. And we're not told about his growing up, about whether people knew in the palace that he was a Hebrew, whether his true identity and origin was well known. But I wonder, for those who knew, if there was always a question, will he truly be one of us? And so for him to side with the Hebrews signaled, okay, he's not safe to have around here. He's not towing the party line like we need him to.
In the words of the Bible, the Sinai is a great and terrible wilderness, a lunar landscape filled with deserts and looming mountains that stretch for some 20,000 square miles. Water wells, even today, are few and far in between. And yet somehow Moses is able to make his way to the Midian, just east of the Gulf of Aqaba, in what today is southern Jordan. That is an amazing feat in itself. And once in the Midian, he meets a group of young women at a well who are being harassed by several shepherds. Moses comes to their defense, and the girls rush back to their father with news of the Egyptian who has saved them. That father is Jethro the priest. Moses is the hero of the hour, and Jethro gives him his daughter Zipporah as his wife. Before long, Zipporah presents Moses with a son.
In fact, when his first son is born, he names him Gershom, which in Hebrew sounds like foreigner there. He says, because I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. And it seems to me that he's a foreigner everywhere he goes. He's a foreigner with the Hebrews, he's a foreigner with the Egyptians, and he's a foreigner with the Midianites. He doesn't belong anywhere.
The Midian plays a very important part in the story, even though the region is not at all in the direction of Canaan, the future promised land. Then why does Moses go there? One answer is quite simple. The Midianites were descendants of Abraham. According to Genesis, the Midianites trace their origins to a son of Abraham's second wife, Keturah, whom he married after Sarah's death. It would therefore be reasonable to assume that they had continued to worship the God of Abraham. At the time, Midian was one of the vassal regions occupied by the 18th dynasty as one of the buffer zones around their borders. Midian was therefore governed by vassal chieftains under Egyptian supervision. It has even been suggested that Moses may have been the son of a Midianite governor who was raised at the palace of Pharaoh as a hostage prince. It would explain why Moses rushed back to the Midian after he killed the Egyptian taskmaster. Moses was simply going home. It also gives a whole new meaning to Jethro, whom Exodus describes as a priest.
But Jethro plays a key role not only in welcoming Moses and giving him a place in the Midianite society, but he also plays a key role in the literary design of the book, because we have his encounter in chapter 2, and then in chapter 4, he sends Moses back to Egypt with his blessing. And then in chapter 18, he comes to meet Moses at Mount Sinai and gives him advice, and he hears about the Exodus and praises Yahweh. And so Jethro becomes then like the bookends around the rescue story of Israel.
In other words, Moses went to the Midian because it was here that the original strain of the faith of Abraham was kept alive, even as the Israelite strain slowly succumbed to oppression in Egypt. That is proven by the next episode in the story, when Moses takes the flocks of his father-in-law and ventures into the lower Sinai.
This is the St. Catherine's Monastery, founded by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD. It is the oldest still functioning monastery in the world, as well as the oldest functioning library. It has very important artifacts and books, including the Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th century manuscript of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, both in Greek. Heavily fortified, the monastery has withstood centuries of invaders, in part because the Prophet Muhammad is said to have stayed here and placed it under his protection. Here, in the shade of Mount Sinai, Moses witnessed a strange phenomenon, a burning bush.
He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed.
God called out to him and said,
I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
Wonder what happens next.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for more. Never did get Roy, or if you did, it never popped up. Okay. Alrighty, yeah, I hope so too. Might just be on vacation or something. Thoughts, questions, concerns, pieces that of new information that you found particularly interesting? What do we think about all this?